Hello everybody, I'm coming on to finish the last video of my series on opening the psychic senses. And today I'm talking about synchronicity. One of the things that starts to manifest as we become aware and start to interact with our soul senses, and we start to see the things that are going on internally act out in our external world as signs or symbols or oracles, if you want to call it that, that answer questions that we're holding internally or put us in a direction of where to go. They're basically communications that the natural world or the outside world is confirming or aligning with what's happening in the internal world. So synchronicity is a term that Carl Jung developed to describe these meaningful coincidences. He really made the point that these aren't coincidences per se, because he felt they were more meaningful, that they were really this collective consciousness responding to what's going on in a personal consciousness. And he developed this idea of synchronicity by doing work with his patients, doing dream work and doing work on himself, and starting to see this pattern of these inner symbols that were coming up in people's dreams starting to manifest in their outer world in synchronistic ways. So today when I'm talking about synchronicity, I'm really wanting to talk about it in the sense of like, how does synchronicity have anything to do with our soul senses? And as I talked about earlier, our soul senses are really our psychic senses. They're the ways that we perceive the non-physical world. And so synchronicity is really the non-physical world responding to what energy we are emitting. So what's going on in our internal world ultimately shapes the energy that we hold in our field, and that we're within a field of consciousness, and that field of consciousness responds. You know, synchronicity is something that I think it's a pretty popular term now. I think most people know what it is and have experienced it. It's different than deja vu. So if you know what deja vu is a moment when you feel like, you know, something is playing out in front of you and you go, it's like just a moment of recognition where you've been there before or you've seen this before. But then when you rationalize it, you realize, you know, I've never been with this person at this place before, or I've never been to this place before. So how could it's like a remembering of something that hasn't happened, you know, in your waking life. And there's a number of explanations to what deja vu is, but it's different than synchronicity, because deja vu is really like a collapse in time and space, whereas synchronicity is really energy reacting to energy. And also it's the way our intuition can give us messages. And it's also a way that our loved ones and our spirit guides and our angels, God, source, all of those things, whatever you believe in, can give us messages and give us nudges, because they cannot direct our lives for us. They can't tell us what to do because we have free will. At best, when we ask for help, or when we're asking a question internally about what should I do, then we can get signs and symbols, and we can get communications through our intuition and our soul senses. So today I wanted to talk about synchronicity, but I also wanted to respond to a video, I believe it was the first video in the series, where I was getting some comments about someone else who's had experiences with shadow figures, because I've had a lot of synchronicities around my exploration of shadow figures. So I told my story about my childhood and having these darker than dark shadow figures, which were always larger than human size, like probably 9 foot tall, in my room at night, and standing and just watching me, and I could feel their malintent towards me, and how terrified I was of those shadow figures. That has consistently showed up for me night after night after night, and how it really made it hard for me to trust other intuitions, because when I went for help from my parents, my brother, about these shadow figures, they told me, oh, it's not real, it's your imagination. You know, how can you still be afraid of the dark? Da, da, da. So I really started to tell myself, you know, this isn't real, it's not real. And I would lay there in bed as if this figure is there, and I could see it with my physical eyes in the physical world. I try to convince myself that this isn't real. And so I had a major cognitive dissonance inside myself about my relationship to what's real and what's not real. But either way, my fear was really real towards these shadow figures. So I basically kind of shoved that in the closet for a long time. I stopped having experiences with shadow figures when I was about 11 or 12 years old. It's really close to the time when I had a head trauma that changed my life dramatically. And it was also close to a time when I had a spirit guide come to me and show me that I could be protected. And I called upon that guide at night, and I no longer saw shadow spirits in any of the houses I lived in from that moment on. So I didn't really have experiences with them for a long time. I really always wondered, what are they? Because I knew they were different than, deceased people or ghosts, because with deceased people or ghosts, I could feel their presence and they feel human, whereas shadow figures never felt human. They never felt like they were human, and that's the best way I can describe it. But as I started doing the depth psychology program, I found that a lot of the inner work that was coming up in me was about my relationship to my intuition, and a lot of the healing I had to do around it was from the traumas of me and these shadow figures. So the first year of the program, I did a lot of inner work around shadow figures, and then I had a lot of dreams about shadow figures. All this stuff came up, and I hadn't thought about them in a long time. Basically, the summer between the first year and second year, I started to do research. I started to really ask, what are shadow figures? I wanted to know. And as I started to hold that question actively in my field, and I had meditated on it, I had dropped in my soul space, I had done research, I had watched documentaries, so I was getting information from all kinds of sources. I started to get synchronistic answers about shadow figures. So I think one of the first things I did was I researched it online, searched the word shadow figures, and I read some stuff about it. And then in one of the groups I'm a member of on Facebook, I saw someone post a video about shadow figures, and I watched that, and then I was directed to another video on YouTube, which is like this expert that has done research on shadow figures. And I started to learn cross-cultural experiences with these shadow figures. So I believe it's in India. They call it the jinn, so like Jinn. It's like a genie spirit that is usually, well, they can be maleficent or they can be benevolent. It just depends on the energy, I guess. But that they're not human spirits, so that confirmed my feeling that they weren't human. And then I ran into some documentaries, and the synchronicity of it was like I had just finished having a conversation with my husband or my friend on the phone about shadow figures and how I've been dreaming about them and really wondering what they were, and telling them how I saw this documentary and I learned about the jinn. And then literally I would finish that conversation, and when I would go to a show that I was watching on TV, and they would start like pretty much right after I press play from the middle of an episode, they start talking about shadow figures. And so I was watching the series called A Haunting. I had just finished a conversation with my husband, and I went to play an episode that was in the middle of it, and the next episode was about these boys that grew up seeing shadow figures their entire childhood, and having like them actually physically attack them, which thank God I never had that happen. They never physically attacked me. I was very careful about my level of fear, because I knew intuitively as a kid, if I let my terror get control of me, that it would weaken my system and somehow they would be able to hurt me. And I still believe that to this day, that that's true. And so these boys grow up and they end up living in these houses that have hauntings, and they end up becoming ghost hunters. But they described the shadow figures as being demonic forces, which didn't resonate with me, because I've felt really demonic energy before in locations, and with the energy of demonic forces, I almost immediately feel nausea and also a really putrid smell and just really oppressive energy, like I can't breathe. And with the shadow figures, that's not how it felt. It didn't feel demonic in that way. So I was getting these answers, but I was also, my intuition, my soul was answering these questions for me. Another synchronistic thing that happened was I had just been visiting my friend and pretty much talking with her all night, and we had been talking about shadow figures because I had just watched a documentary about people who have been contacted by what they believe are extraterrestrials. I've never had any of those experiences, but I'm curious about aliens and extraterrestrials and stuff. I think it's interesting. So I was watching this documentary about people who have had contact, and a number of them told stories about how there seems to be a pattern of events in contactees, I don't know how they say it, that a lot of them had experiences in childhood where they saw shadow figures in their room at night, and they were terrified. And some of them would have abduction experiences, but most of them would just notice these watchers in their room at night. And then as adults, they ended up having these abduction experiences, and they made the connection of the shadow figures from their childhood and the abductions, that they had been being watched for a long time by these extraterrestrials. And so that gave me chills all over when I heard that, because I still don't know exactly what I believe about aliens, but the fact that I know that they're not human, like what else could they be? they could be multidimensional. Well, extraterrestrials can be multidimensional. So that kind of opened up my mind, and I had just gotten done talking to my friend about that. And then I got in my car. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning to drive home. I turned it to the AM station to listen to Coast because I was like, oh, Coast to Coast is on. So I turned it to the AM station, and I kid you not, there was George Noory, the host of the show, was introducing a person that was going to be on the show with him, and he said he's an autistic kid that was very severely autistic, like nonverbal, completely nonverbal, basically all the way up till he was 18, and then had an abductee experience, and his autism was healed. And so they were talking about this connection between abduction experiences and being spontaneously healed from seemingly unhealable mental illnesses or diseases. So this guy that, used to be a nonverbal autistic person was speaking, and he was speaking very clearly. He was talking on the show about his childhood experiences and seeing these shadow figures. And he couldn't tell his parents about it because he couldn't speak. And he said they were very terrifying, and he had a really hard time sleeping at night. And then when he had the abduction experience, he was communicated to by these extraterrestrials that they had been watching him for a while, and that they were going to help him to heal. And they basically told him that they were the shadow figures. So I had chills all over. It was like I just got done telling my friend about this documentary I saw about shadow figures and aliens, and then I get in my car, I turn on the radio, and what's on the radio? A person talking about how they had shadow figures in their childhood, and that they were now abducted, and that anyway, it just confirmed the first synchronicity that I had. And still, it didn't feel quite right for me. It didn't feel, because I haven't had any abduction experiences. In the documentary, they said that, in their 20s and 30s, they would have abduction experiences. Well, I'm 35. I still don't have any conscious remembrance of any abduction experiences. Don't feel like that resonates for me. So later on, I'm doing research for my my thesis, and which is about after-death communication. So I'm doing research about, what's the difference between psychosis and spiritual experiences, because spiritual experiences have been pathologized for a really long time. So people that say they communicate with their dead ones, will be looked at by a mental health professional as someone that may be unstable or unhealthy mentally. And so I've been reading this book, which I did a couple of videos on in this group already about it, Spiritual Emergency. It's an older book. It's from the 80s. It's a bunch of psychologists, psychiatrists that are basically making a movement to support people who are having basically transpersonal crises, psychic opening experiences, and being pathologized and labeled as mentally ill and going on medication, which actually can make the process worse. So they talk about psychic opening processes also in this book. And I had just been talking to someone, I think it was my friend on the phone. I was talking to her about the shadow figures and how I had a dream about shadow figures, and had been really actively thinking about what are shadow figures? And I went to read the book because I had been halfway through a chapter, and it was about shamanic crises and psychic openings. When insanity is a blessing, the message of shamanism. And quite literally, the second paragraph that I'm reading has a quote from a shaman from Siberia, talking about how do you know when someone's a shaman? What experience do they go through that makes the community recognize them as a shaman? And they're talking about how, usually they become deathly ill, and then they're miraculously healed through some spiritual experience, and then they're able to help heal other people. And that's kind of what they're talking about. But then it talks about another shaman who was present added this sentence: the man chosen for shamandom is first recognized by the black spirits, the spirits of the dead shamans, who are called black spirits. They make the chosen one ill, and then they are forced to become a shaman. And I had chills all up and down my body, and I had a full recognition that this is what it was for me. And I think it talks about it more a little bit after that. And basically what it's saying is that shamans from before, so ancestral lineages of shamans in that culture, will pass on. And part of the shaman role is to come back as a spirit to awaken the next generation of shamans. and that they come back in the form of a black spirit. So I don't know if that actually means they look like a shadow figure, but I had chills all over, and it seemed to be confirming for me that they come back to the next generation of shamans to help awaken them, usually through making them very ill or very scared, or like having a psychotic break with and having a break with reality to help them to break into the spiritual dimension, to then be suddenly healed and then initiate them basically into shamanhood. So when I was a kid, I wasn't ill, but I had major internal conflict about the nature of reality, because I was having all these spiritual experiences in a family that would not recognize them or value them as being important, or even recognizing them as being real. And that consistent presence of that shadow figure, later on I realized that that is what helped me to be grounded into the firm belief that I have that the spiritual dimension is real. Because no matter how much I told myself it wasn't real, no matter how much I wanted it to not be real, it kept coming back over and over again. And I've had experiences with my ancestors that were shamans telling me things about my lineage, because, you know, as far as I know, in my family, in my immediate family, I'm the only one that is able to connect with spirits and stuff. They've had spiritual experiences, they've seen ghosts, that I always felt like I was the only one. So it always made me wonder, like, well, who else in my family is like that? Like, there has to be some ancestors that are like me. Like, if this is an inherited trait, where am I getting this from, right? So this really interested me, and this was about the same time I was starting to feel really connected to an ancestor of mine that I had never met, that was showing up for me. And actually, in my mediumship development classes, we do practice readings on each other. A couple of the practicing mediums that had given me readings had picked up on a spirit that sounded a lot like the ancestor that I never met. Like, I know the details of how she died and, you know, who she was, and they were picking up on her, and their messages were that she was an ancestor that was wanting to connect with me. So I had been having synchronicities through readings. I had been having synchronicities through me working in my family tree and coming across her and feeling energetically connected to her, and then reading this in that book. So it was like these questions that were really unanswerable on a mind human level, like on ego level. Like, I could not intellectualize this stuff. I started to have experience after experience after experience that was really synchronistic. Like, the timing of it was parallel to when I was thinking about it, talking about it, or openly asking the question inside, and then something outside would manifest that would directly relate to it, and in my eyes, answer my question. And in this sense, you know, I had a series of events that unfolded that not all of them resonated as being true, but they were answers to the question. Like, my general question is like, what are shadow figures? So I got a bunch of answers about what they could be, what they are. And there was another synchronicity where I was actually writing a paper about shadow figures for my school. How cool is that? I get to write about my shadow figures in a master's degree program. It still makes me laugh. And I'm telling you, I had never told another soul in my entire life about shadow figures. And here I am writing papers about it to professors that are psychologists. It's just kind of amazing. But to feel safe to be able to explore this topic was really healing for me. So I had just finished writing I was in the middle of writing a paper about this, about my relationship to my childhood experiences, my traumas around spiritual experiences with shadow figures. And again, I turned on my show that was like halfway through an episode, and one of the first things that came on was footage. It was like some show where they have footage of like paranormal stuff. And I'd really like to listen and watch paranormal things, if you haven't noticed. And they had documented images of these shadow figures in a forest. And there was a series of videos that captured these shadow entities moving from behind trees in dark forests. And there's like this one forest where it's like famously known that you don't go in that forest because there's these shadow figures there. And the narrators, the hosts of the show, had talked about how they had done research about shadow figures, and that they are sometimes interpreted, like, I believe, Native American cultures, as earth spirits, the protectors of forests, which, like, elemental energy, which gave me chills all over, because I had actually also seen shadow figures in forests before and felt them to be really like defensive energy, like made you want to just like go away, like they don't want you to be here kind of feeling. I also have sensed shadow figures in places that have been abandoned and have like burnt down, or like places that are not being lived in and haven't been lived in for a while. Shadow figures often are found in those locations, and I do think that they are elemental protective energies. Like they're protecting a space for non-human interaction. I don't know. So that was another synchronicity and another layer of answer that I got to that question. So basically, my message here with synchronicity and intuition and your soul space, dropping into your meditative soul space, is you can't always get your answers in that meditative soul space, especially when it's something that is so personal and so close to you that it's hard to get the answer for. Sometimes it's like you get the answer objectively from the outside world, and that is what is most validating, and that is the way you can receive the answer through that channel. So synchronicity can be a way that your intuition is answering questions or giving you signs and symbols for directions. Synchronicity is a way that we can communicate to non-physical energy, so our own soul. Synchronicity is a way for us to communicate to our guides, our angels, and our loved ones. So I want to talk about spirit synchronicity. So in my research for after-death communication for my thesis, one of the major spirit signs or perceived communications from people's loved ones are synchronicities, which are meaningful coincidences, as Carl Jung says. So what that looks like is like thinking about your loved one that has died, and the research shows that these after-death communications, so this contact from our loved ones, happens most likely in the first year after someone passes. The first few months after someone passes is a high likelihood, especially if they died in a traumatic way. There's unresolved issues or questions, or you just miss them tremendously. Or if you're really, really holding in your heart, like, where are they? Are they safe? Then they'll come and contact you to reassure you, to give you answers about the questions you're holding about life and death. So these synchronicities will happen, like people will be driving. When you're driving, you're in an altered state of consciousness, so it's easy to receive messages from spirit. You'll be thinking about your loved one, and then suddenly on the radio, your song will come on, like the song that you associate with that person, and you'll feel their presence, and it'll just feel like a gigantic hug. That is a really common synchronicity. Another synchronicity that spirit will use to communicate is through animal or insect behavior. The animal or insect is not always associated with the person before they've died. So like you may not have associated butterflies with your grandfather before he passed, but somehow after he passed, whenever you're thinking about him or wondering if he's okay, somehow a butterfly comes into the picture. And that may be an actual living butterfly. It might actually be like a butterfly on a sign. It could be a butterfly that comes on a commercial the second you're thinking about him. But you start to make these connections that every time you're thinking about that particular loved one, this one outer world thing shows up. And that could be animals and insects. Common signs from animals and insects are butterflies. Cardinals are a really big sign. Birds of all kinds, basically. People have seen pennies as being a sign, or maybe it'll be something that was meaningful in relationship to that person. Let's say they collected the little tiny miniature spoons, that you get at like gift shops, and you randomly run across one as you're thinking about your grandma or something like that. So there'll be these synchronistic signs that they bring to you as evidence, like an outer communication to answer your question of like, are you here? Can you hear me? Are you okay? Are you alive? Do you still exist? And they'll answer questions through synchronicity. And I would say anytime you feel like something happens in your outer world and it makes you think of your loved one, that's a communication. Anytime you think about the loved one and you feel them, it's almost like your awareness and attention being on them actually brings their energy close to you. So it doesn't matter if they're contacting you or you're contacting them. Anytime there's a thought about them, you're in contact with them. They know it. So I want to say that too. Because one thing I can tell you is that in my research with anomalous experiences, not just contact with the dead, but any kind of anomalous experience, that there's some sort of after effect in a person. It kind of cracks them open to start to consider alternate reality as being something real, and it starts to get them asking questions, and then they start to have synchronicities to get those questions answered. So oftentimes I'll have people in readings ask me questions about things, and I'll get the message that they need to drop into their soul space and they need to ask, because it's really their soul trying to bring the truth to them, to help them remember what the truth is inside them, and that it's not always something that you can get from someone else. Oftentimes only we can really get the real deep, profound truth, and we get that by dropping into our soul space And by walking throughout the day, holding in our hearts what it is we wish to have answers for, and paying attention to what's happening in our outer world and noticing those meaningful coincidences and realizing they're not coincidences, they're communications. So thank you again for tuning in. Like I said, this is the last video of the Psychic Senses, Opening the Psychic Senses series. If you have any questions, comments, please post them below and I will get back to you. I hope these were meaningful videos for you and that you got a chance to watch them and enjoy them. If you have any recommendations or suggestions or want to know about any of these topics in more detail, let me know. I would love to make a video for you all. All right, see you later.